I read Binti, The Night Masquerade by Nnedi Okorafor, which is the third book in a trilogy. And I'm going to be discussing all three books in this podcast. So if you don't want to be spoiled for that, then stop listening. So this is a reread for me, like I've said the previous two times. And the story picks up where the cliffhanger leaves off. Binti is trying to get back to her home village. She's with the desert people, and she's met a new companion named Nnedi, who is also a harmonizer among the desert people. So Binti has this harmonizer ability. Her father has the harmonizer ability. This guy does too. It's a special ability that allows for almost like supernatural powers or kind of psychic powers. And previously, when I talked about the first book, I said that the Edan device allowed her to understand the Medus language somehow, but it's actually her harmonizer ability which allowed her to do this. And it probably said that in the story. This is just simply a mistake, a misunderstanding on my part, which is kind of part of this project. And like, I'm not totally comfortable with having put out there a misinterpretation of just the basic plot, but it does kind of showcase part of the reason why I'm doing a project like this of like, I just read the book and then flat out record my thoughts without doing a whole bunch of research or double checking stuff, because I'm not trying to do a comprehensive style podcast like I would do if it was a fully produced show, the way that we did with Measures of Truth, which is about His Dark Materials, or like The Problem with Lockwood and Co. Instead, I'm trying to do something that's like way more off the top of my head, which is not to make an excuse for a mistake like this, but just to show that I'm going to misinterpret things as we go along. And that's just part of the nature of the project. Because mostly I want to get down my thoughts and feelings and views on everything that I read, also as like a reference for myself, so I can just check back with it and be like, what was this about? What was I thinking when I was, the connections I'm making, blah, blah, blah. So if I make a mistake, please excuse. I don't mean to. Sorry about that. Anyway, her harmonizer ability is what allows her to speak to the Medus. And we see this with a story that Nnedi tells her about how he is able to connect with some elephants early in his life. And they try to murder every human that they see in this future, I guess because they were tired of getting poached by people. And he's able to negotiate with the elephants and like teach them that he means them no harm. And so he negotiates a peace, which is an important theme to introduce early on in this part of the story. It takes them a while to travel back to her hometown, but by the time that she does, the whole place is in flames. Her homestead specifically has been like completely destroyed. And so she believes her family is dead. And the Kush people, who have been talked about throughout the series and are kind of like the political power in the region, have moved in with their military and occupied everything. They're the ones who are causing this attack to happen. And all of the Himba people are hiding, and the desert people have like scattered into the wilderness. The Kush people want to destroy or capture Okwu, and probably Binti too, because of her Medus biology. They have had a war with the Medus in the past. Currently, they're in a time of treaty, but obviously it's like a very tenuous treaty. There's still a lot of hatred on both sides. And these people just basically want revenge for whatever wrongs they believe happened to the past, people and stuff. So this goes back, we find out, like generations. So it's not like, oh, you killed my father and things like that. This is like, you killed my great-great-great-grandfather kind of stuff. Also, amongst all the chaos, Binti sees the night masquerade once again, and this supernatural creature is an omen of change. and can only be seen by men. And so it's very disturbing to her once again to see this thing. And it's like during the daytime as well. It's only supposed to come out at night, according to its legends. Hence the name Night Masquerade. And she also feels sure, just to up the urgency of this whole thing, that there are Medus ships, warships that are nearby. They're like under the water. And part of the reason that Oku wanted to go out there was because he was communing with them and kind of giving reconnaissance and intelligence about the Kush to them. And so this whole thing was like a little bit of an excuse to kind of kick off a new chapter to the war for both sides, perhaps. And Binti wants to avoid this at all costs because her Himba people are going to be caught in the crossfire and her community is going to be destroyed. So she calls an emergency meeting of the elders and demands that peace talks be enacted with the Kush, which is what happens. And Binti demonstrates some of her powers that she's acquired throughout the course of the story and amazes the people on every side of the conflict. She impresses the Kush leaders with her logic and her negotiating skills, but also, like I said, like her electricity powers and her Medus tentacles and all that kind of stuff. So like everybody is wowed by Binti appropriately. She is amazing. And then it seems like peace is going to be reestablished because Binti knows that her life as it is would never have been possible in a state of active warfare. And the prosperity of her people depends on peace being around because like they make all of these astrolabes that are used throughout the galaxy by people, but they can't produce that stuff. They can't innovate if they're caught in the middle of a serious conflict like this. So she needs everything to calm down for the benefit of her community. Because at this point, she believes that her entire family is dead. So she's kind of lost everything personally. And this isn't about, simply saving her mom and dad, brothers and sisters. It's about the wider community who at large have kind of rejected Binti in a lot of ways. So she's doing this out of a real sense of duty and not like a personal kind of loyalty, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Nonetheless, one of the Kush soldiers cracks off a shot and hits one of the Medus, and this just kicks off a full-on confrontation between both military forces that have, all of their warships here ready to go, and this becomes like a literal war zone. And in the midst of the conflict and all of the bombs going off and stuff like that, Binti literally gets blown up and dies. And we're like not even halfway through this book, and she's like been the main character in a first person style narrative even, and then she's dead, which is like super surprising. Like this is a very bold narrative choice, I think, really difficult to pull off. But luckily we've been introduced to Mwini, and he also has the harmonizer ability like Binti, and so we can kind of understand his perspective. He comes from the desert people, so he has some, kind of similarities to Binti, I guess, but he becomes the primary perspective character for a while after this. But I don't think that this move is purely about like shock value or doing something confusing or edgy or like postmodern, blah, 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 blah. Okorafor is a much better writer than that. We've been dealing through the entire story so far, the first two books included, with issues of identity and alienation and like, who is Binti? What is she becoming? Who will she be when this becoming is completed? And there's a sense in which Binti needs to die as she was in order to become who she will be in a symbolic sense, right? And all of us kind of go through this, I think, where we transform from our childhood selves into our adult selves. And we can say, in some respect, that the childhood self has died, if you will. And a lot of us mourn that childhood death. There's a real sadness that goes around the entry into adulthood because there's a loss of innocence. There's a taking on of responsibility that means that possibilities close to us. And the entire experience has a kind of melancholy to it that is not purely about, becoming more powerful and gaining your agency, but instead there's a real kind of grief to it that is not unsimilar to death. So I think it's appropriate in a story that's kind of a coming of age story to have a character die. It's just usually not the main character whose name is on the book, but these are some bold choices. I think this works. It works for me. It's very shocking the first time that I read it, I remember. But like I said, I think also symbolically it works, and there's a lot of interesting stuff that she does with it. Minwini and Okru kind of team up to take care of Binti's remains, and he's able to converse with Okru as well, despite not sharing a biology, because again of the harmonizer abilities. And also with those harmonizer abilities, he finds out that the house that Binti grew up in and where her family went to shelter down during the attack have secret compartments, secret like chambers and in rooms and stuff that nobody knew about, including Binti, that like her mother was in charge of building. And so actually what happened was her family survived the attack because they were in these secret places. And so it's as if her family had died, like we believed that in the narrative, but then come to find out that they didn't die. And so they're restored back into the story, almost like the end of the book of Job or something like that, or like a fairy tale almost. So they're okay. That's a relief. But still the war is happening and everything. And mainly we just want to get Binti buried properly. But before she died, she talked to Nnedi about seeing a vision, and he shares this vision of the rings of Saturn and something out there calling to her and telling her to come out there. And so he has the idea that he should take her out there and maybe leave her remains in space or something like that. He's not totally sure what's going to happen, but he feels like that's what she would have wanted. And so they take her to the ship that we've been riding on for the whole story, but that ship was pregnant the last time we saw it, and since then has had its baby, and the baby ship is the one that's going to take them to Saturn. And so they put her body on the ship, and Okwu and Imwini get on there, and they all take off to go off to Saturn. And on the way there, Binti wakes back up and her body is repaired and she is resurrected essentially by, I guess, the microbes on the living ship. She manages to kind of commune with the ship. So we shift away from his perspective and then back into Binti's first person perspective. And it's explained to her that the ship has shared its body and DNA and the way that its body works to rebuild her. And so a lot of her body now is actually made of the same biological material as the ship. And so once again, there's an alien blending that's happened here, where she's taken on yet another alien heritage. But she finds that this one also comes with more capabilities. And so instead of communication, she's able to fuse her consciousness with the ship and basically like pilot it the same way that you pilot your body, if you will. And so she's able to like fly through space. She starts doing like barrel rolls and loop de loops and speeding up and slowing down. And of course, the poor Nnedi on the ship is like thrown all over the place on the inside. She's not thinking about like how that's going to affect people. But I guess there's like gravity on the ship. I don't really know how that works, but whatever. It's pretty funny when it happens. I really like this part. And it's also beautiful because, there's like a real freedom that she gets to experience. So much of the story has been about Binti's anxiety and sadness and estrangement from everyone. And this whole thing feels very freeing and emancipatory and just immediately like good. It just feels good. So we got Binti back. That feels good. She's out here. Like, it's almost like she's in heaven or something. I mean, she's literally like in the heavens and she's like able to fly and all this cool stuff. But in any case, they make it out to Saturn, and there are some aliens out there in the Saturn rings, and they commune with Binti and they ask her about the university. And she tells them, like, I think the university is great. It was a really good experience. And the aliens are basically like, hey, thanks for the recommendation. And then they just like vanish. And so then Binti decides to also go to the university along with Okwu and Imwini. And the entire kind of structure of the story, I think, of the second and third book are like a retelling of the first book in some ways, if you look at it, where Binti doesn't fit in at home and then she dies and goes to the university. So like in the first book, you'd be like, well, Alan, she doesn't die in the first book. Come on. Like, you were talking about making a mistake of misreading. Like, what are you talking about? I just mean that everybody on the ship died, right? And it was kind of like she, in quotes, should have died. And this time she did die. And then she ends up at the university anyway. So I don't know. I just see a very similar structure of this leaving home to go to university, this kind of rite of passage for growing up in our modern society where teenagers leave their parents' home, they go to a university, and they start to become who they're going to be as adults. And like I said, that's a dying away of your childish self, which makes room for the new persona that's going to be your adult experience of life. And so this is literalized in the story. She like literally dies and then she arrives back at the university. They're able to analyze her body and find out that she is directly tied to the ship in a way that she has like a symbiotic relationship to it. She can't be too far away from it or she's going to die. So for the rest of her life, she's going to need to be close to this younger ship in order to live. At the same time, there's like an emerging romance between her and Imwitty, and the biologist who tells her about her connection to the ship also informs her that if she is ever going to have children, it's more than likely that, for one thing, they will have Medus biology the same way that she does, and that additionally, the one who will be carrying her child will probably be Okwu, because that's just the way that their friendship or bonding kind of works. And so there's not like sexual intercourse needed, but instead it's just kind of a genetic exchange, which results in a next generation that combines the genetic material in some way. And that's going to be something that Okwu is going to gestate and then give birth to. And so there's like a weird kind of melange of how the next generation is going to emerge from all of the hybrid genealogies that are stirring around in Binti. And it seems to me that like Binti in a lot of ways is symbolic of kind of cultural intercourse. I mean, not to keep bringing it back to sex or something, but like that's just the terminology of a meeting of different cultures that results in a new generation of culture that is shared. Some kind of exchange that happens that changes the culture forever afterward. And this kind of idea is actually extremely unpopular these days and is even regarded, I would say, with more than suspicion, but like a deep skepticism that it's even possible, which I think is really weird and like out of touch with historical norms because there's like a high vigilance that goes on around cultural appropriation. And so like if you think about it, in the terms of Binti, like is there cultural appropriation happening diegetically at all from Binti? She When she lived in her village, she had a shared heritage of the desert people and the Himba people. And then once she leaves, she gains a heritage of the Meduse people, and then more and more and more people. And so like did she culturally like appropriate Medus ways? Is she like she got into the university and got Okwu into the university based on like the weird hybridity of that situation. So like was that an exploitation of that cultural exchange? Was it an appropriation that was leveraged to enrich her? Like I don't really think so. And like people are very afraid of cultural appropriation. I think, in a that's a good thing. It used to not even be on a lot of people's radar to consider like, okay, who gets to tell what stories and how and whatnot. But they kind of forget the root reason for that, I think. If you have someone who is not of a particular heritage and they think they're like, oh, there's this cool exotic culture. I would make a lot of money if I told a story involving those people and just like willy nilly take the details of it and then put it out there in a sensational way and people pick it up and like, oh, cool, it's so exotic and weird. I love this. This is great escapist fiction. Then that demeans an actual group of people who exist in the real world while simultaneously like exploiting their culture in order to make money. I think we can all agree that that is distasteful and lazy and not to be encouraged in the culture. But actual cultural intercourse is not the same as cultural appropriation. And a lot of people seem confused on this idea, I think. So, for example, like in our own actual history, you had the Portuguese going around the world in the early colonialist days and, setting up trade and doing missionary work outside of Europe and encountering places like, North and South America where they encounter new foods and the methods that are used to refine those foods and like turn them into edible products. So, for example, like chocolate or chilies, things like that. Well, they go and they take the chilies from South America and they end up bringing them to the Hindu people in India. And those people incorporate the chilies into their food. And what we think of today as like, oh, yeah, that's Indian food. It's very, very spicy. Well, it didn't used to be spicy before the Portuguese had cultural intercourse with the Indians. And then, like later, there's a more violent colonialism that happens between India and the English. But the English end up picking up the tradition of eating curry, which comes from Indian culture, but is now considered like an English food, including the spiciness that comes from South America. And so it's just normal for cultures to exchange things. I mean, that's like a very mundane example of like actual food exchange. But I think you can see how this applies to Binti, that she is bringing together the Kush culture, the Medus, the Himba, the desert people. All these people are exchanging and changing what they are. That's a big part of this story. And part of that change is, according to the story, going to be war. And I think the war can be understood in the same terms as the panic attacks that Binti was having earlier in the story. These kind of like growing pains psychically that she was experiencing that are dramatized. Like, I don't want to say that, like, oh, to minimize her panic attacks and her PTSD. A serious thing happened to her where she watched, her entire peer group get murdered in front of her face. But that's just a dramatization of what it is like to be a teenager growing into an adult. You have to understand it symbolically for what I'm saying. And so her panic attacks if we blow this up to a social level instead of being about an individual, is kind of like what happens with war. It's a bad coping mechanism to change. It's an inability to cope with the reality of different cultures meeting with each other and the change that is going to inevitably happen. When you go to war with somebody, it's to try and end that other culture. And there's a thought there that your culture will be preserved in the aftermath. Like, that's the goal of the society, is to end the other society and have your society continue on unchanged. Binti understands that this is not possible and that the war is just like one outcome of the inevitability of all things changing. Once she accepts that change is an inevitability and it's a part of life, and again, we come back to like the biological characteristic of life and how much everybody's biology is tied into this whole experience throughout the 3 books. The biological nature of the ship, the way that it has a baby, the way that the baby gives her life, and how her body itself is a symbol of this cultural intercourse that's happening between all of these different people groups, all of these different histories meeting together in a kind of like human delta. If you think of them as different rivers flowing into Binti, she becomes the resting place for all of these different things that are going to be a new headwater in history. And so as she goes to the university and does work to understand exactly what she now is, she's going to produce something new that's going to further change all of these different groups. And so change lies at the heart of the story in a lot of ways. But that change is not merely like on the individual level, it's societal. And I think that Okorafor is laying out for us the way that, there's violence, but there's also economic exchange, the exchanges of food, because at various times, different people from different cultures eat food together, and the exchanges of history. And so she's showing that, like, there is no actual way to hedge these societies against each other and keep them as, like, quote unquote, pure, because nothing in life actually operates that way. Everything is in a network that interacts with each other, and everything changes over time. And so what the Himba people are now, they will not be later. And the same thing for the desert people, and on and on. At the same time, their identity is special and it does matter and it is respected in the story. And so this isn't a story about like, oh, everything should be a melting pot, because that's actually like a very monological way to interpret cultural exchange, to be like, there's some kind of baseline resting point of all cultures. And so it needs to just like settle into that baseline culture. And that is not really cultural intercourse. That's assimilation. It's like a different thing. That's not what I'm talking about. Like, the Indian people and the Portuguese people still exist to this day as separate people. The South American food products still exist as their own thing. But all of those things did mix together to produce something unique in Indian culture that's considered like normal and a part of their heritage, that emerged out of the interactions between all those different people groups. And so that's different than an idea of like a melting pot that assimilates all cultures into one monoculture. So I think Okorafor just does an amazing job of playing with all of these themes, using, once again, that I keep saying this about the tropes of the aliens and redefining what that means. Who is alien in this story? And Binti is like the weirdest alien of all, but she's also like the most human. And she even represents the intersection of societies by the end of the story. And so, as short as all three of these stories are, they just like are so full and dense with ideas and themes and so well written. Just always a pleasure to come back to anything that Nnedi Okorafor writes, but Binti is something special.